Hey everybody, welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. This is the fall winter 2023-2024 class, and it's January 8th, 2024, and we are on office hour 6. We've got a hang-on question that I kind of kick down the road every couple of office hours because I didn't really have a chance to research it. Finally did have an answer for that. And then Bjorn has some questions about soil. So I'm going to jump into that. But before I do, I'm just curious for everybody who's on the call, how's the course going for you? Are you feeling like you're well-resourced to finish the course? Are you feeling like you're getting what you were hoping for out of the course? Kind of anything under the sun, because I'd like to help direct either your next steps in the course accurately or find where we need to shore up some of the education. Feel free just to unmute.
I can go first. I've really enjoyed the course so far. I'm always really surprised every week. I feel like I have learned a lot. And I think with the practical application of our own site and the PowerPoint slide, I feel like there's a lot of knowledge retention as well, which can be difficult, I think, in online courses. So I've really enjoyed that. I think I'm looking forward to like really getting into sort of like the nuts and bolts of like the design of the site. I'm really eager, like now that it's the new year and the spring is coming, I'm eager to know like what I'll be able to do in the coming months and what I'll be able to actually implement. So I'm excited to kind of progress a bit further and start to think about like specific plants and just different things that I want to do on the site. But yeah, so far so good. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Amazing. Yeah, that's awesome. And I think as we get into the design conversation, any point questions about your site, the Zoom office hours are a great place to bring those conversations. So that way you can just go, hey, I really want to know how to do this on my site, and we can go through it. That's what it's for. So we can get really personal and really intimate in terms of your site and what you want done in the office hours. And then in the feedback coming up for assignments, weeks 6 through 10, just be conscientious of really asking questions about what I'm seeing in terms of your design site. I'll offer things every once in a while, but the point of the course isn't for me to design the site for you, nor is it for me to comment on every single design aspect that I see within the assignments. The point of the design course is really for you to learn about permaculture and how it works and the process of. And so from an instructor side, I'm grading the rubric. And then if I see something that's outlandish, I'm going to point it out. But if you have a specific question about something about your site, feel free to bring it up in that Q&A slide at the end of your assignment as well. Christian and Deanna, how's the course for you guys?
Yeah, I can jump in if that's okay, Christian. Yeah, it's going well. I think I had high hopes of getting a lot more done over the holidays, and I did not, to be honest. So now I'm like, oh God, like I feel like the next couple of weeks are gonna fly by. So yeah, I'm feeling like confident in terms of kind of an assessment. But then when I think about designing this site or future sites, or when I think about like this work in general, it's still like I feel like I'm very new in terms of plants or like maybe the more horticulture side of things. And I know we'll be getting more into that in the coming weeks, but like I'm feeling confident, but not obviously I'm still new to it all. So still learning with everything. So kind of just taking it 1 week at a time from here to stay on top of things. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I think I said this to everybody in the very first office hour. It took me close to 3 years and then finally 5 to feel totally confident in designing a site in my bio. So it's a process of developing a literacy of not only the principles and the practices within permaculture, but also the site specifics, like what is the plant palette for my site and biome? What are the hits? Something that a lot of permaculture designers are in error for doing when they start off is they really suffer from this out of zone-itis affliction, where it's just like, well, we'll try and grow peaches everywhere because that's the pinnacle of this work. And it really isn't. It's about finding a harmonious balance between what works on the site, what's coming into the site naturally, and trying to really reduce inputs as much as possible while creating habitat for people and animals and flora and fauna and all of these different pieces. So what I can recommend, and we can have a conversation about this on any office hour as we get closer to the end, is really starting slow as you start learning about plants. I had the unfortunate and fortunate experience of having one of the most brilliant botanists as my first teacher, who was completely self-taught and had a remarkable memory for plant names, Latin, how they grow, what family they're in, the genus, because they just decided they were going to spend 5 years learning that on their own, total self-study. And so I was taught by Brandon Bauer and was blown away, and then had the false idea that I could ever equal his education without the internal motivation that he had. Because I've never had the internal motivation to become an encyclopedia of our own plants. Still don't. I just don't care enough. So all of that to say that my approach was to kind of date and fall in love with a plant every year. And if I ever got to that place where I intimately knew the plant, I would switch early. But at the beginning, I picked a plant that was local in my biome, that looked like it was a superstar. It was either a great support plant or it was a great producer, because so much in my biome was they really wanted to have more production. So I really wanted to learn about apples. And then I learned the 4 or 5 cultivar selects that were great in my area. I learned how to cultivate them. I learned how to grow them. I learned how to graft and to attend to pest issues, and to attend with non-chemical approaches to pest management, all of that. And that, because it was apples and it was entire family, it took close to 4 years before I felt confident. And there's still things I don't know about apples, but that was my approach: is to pick a plant, date it, so to speak, fall in love with it, and then really get to know it. And that really helped with the horticulture aspect of it.
Okay. Okay. I can start dating some plants then, is
Yeah.
basically takeaway that I have from this.
Totally. Yeah. And date the ones that are appealing to you. This is kind of the same thing that when I got started in teaching, I would be invited into garden clubs and they would ask me, what should we grow? And I thought it was just the craziest thing to ask somebody, because what you want to grow is so specific to you as a person. If you're aesthetically based or olfactory based, you should grow beautiful plants that smell good, period. If you're growing for food for yourself, you should grow food that you like to grow. It was always such a weird question. So similarly, when it comes to plants, I love garlic. I love tomatoes. I love olfactory plants that just, delight the senses. And so I started dating plants that were close to my desires, because again, you ever try to do something that's externally motivated, you're always going to find the point where you're done with it. But if it's internally motivated, like, I like this smell, I like the taste of these plants, it'll always internally motivate you through the moments of hardship, because that'll always happen, right?
Okay.
So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think it's just imposter syndrome that's starting to come up when I think about like going down this path. So this can be a conversation maybe at a later office hour if that's more applicable. I don't want to take up too much time, but
well, and I'll say this, it never goes away. Like, I've never had a certain level of imposter syndrome go away. Like, I just delivered a 145-page feasibility study for 90 acres in the Pacific Northwest. I am more sure about that design than I've ever been about any design. And still I was like, do I know what I'm doing? At the end of the day, because you could have so many people like take a look at that site, and there are so many, because ecology is inherently an interconnected, internodal, self-dependent system. You can move any one of the variables, and 12 to 12 dozen other variables will change in that moment without your total awareness, because we can only take feedback as we can observe a site. So there's an interesting disconnect that it takes time for us to observe a site and to observe our appropriate design responses or our inappropriate design responses. So it takes a lot of time for that feedback to come back to us. And what I found over the years is Sepp Holzer has this great saying, which is, the book of nature is always open for us to read, and when, not if, we get it wrong, to go back and read again. And so I think generally regenerative land designers, permaculture designers are able to disconnect from the erroneous societal belief that there is a right answer, because there isn't when it comes to ecology. And there are just applications that work with and don't work with certain variables and elements. And at some point, all elements have a harmonious equilibrium over time. Either they die or they'll find their equilibrium one way or another. And it's up
Yeah.
to us to really just watch it and to do so without, again, that societal right, wrong,
Mhm.
cultural, societal judgment that I think so many of us hold on to post childhood from this pleasing nature that's into all of us. We had to be pleasers or else we wouldn't get fed. If we didn't give the correct response, we wouldn't be fed. So pleasing in our nature is pan-human. But because we're not forced to go out of a self-pleasing nature by you can see that in indigenous cultures, they'll have a rite of passage where you have to go and take care of yourself. Mostly for men, because for women it was childbirth. And after that, you were an initiated member of human society because you were willing to take on your own responsibility and you were willing to make somebody else upset for your own expression. Because we don't do that, we hold a lot of problematic beliefs. And one of them is this: there's a right answer to this problem. And when it comes to ecology or gardening, there really isn't. There's just a cornucopia of options that we could apply, and depending on all the variables we're going for, the regional regulations, the client's wants and needs, the intrinsic characteristics of the landscape, there's always going to be like a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen different operations that all make sense within that. And I think that is what helped me to stay in this for so long, because imposter syndrome is always there. It's just like, how are you like, in some ways we're saying we know as much as nature, which is a
Yeah.
hilarious belief. And so it's really about saying, well, I think this is the right way to go. And this is why I finally convinced OSU to retitle the final design the working design, because all designs are working designs. None of them are final. Once you're working with nature, everything is in flux. And I actually just rewrote my preface to my reports, basically saying, we're in this intricate balance of flora and fauna, and we have to become both dancer and choreographer at the same time. And it's not an easy thing to do. And so while this for me is a snapshot of what I see on your site, you too have to become dancer and choreographer within this whole incredible interplexing aspect of nature. So I'm with you all the way. I hear you, and I still
Thank
feel
you.
it to this day.
Yeah. No, well, that's such a, I don't know, soothing and open perspective to take in terms of us not having to know as much as nature and always learning, but then being open and keeping in mind things. So thank you for sharing that,
You're most welcome.
normalizing it and then sharing some helpful perspectives.
Yeah, you're most welcome.
Thanks.
Christian, how's the course going for you, sir?
Been going great because I was finally able to get my soil samples with a few last days of unfrozen ground right before Christmas. And now we are back to almost 0.5 meter of snow again. So yeah, that was a close call, but I got it done. In terms of the general course, I think it gave me a good base or kind of framework to see in what kind of areas I'm more interested in or where I want to go deeper. And having a design background, I know I kind of know this evolving nature of design, kind of getting closer and closer to what works best, and that there's never the right answer, I guess. So yeah, I think that has been mostly what I've taken so far, like a good overview on what's there, and also like the different approach to designing for the land instead of for the money and the client, I guess. Well, you also, but not as the main focus.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Well said. I imagine because you work in design, you've probably seen that Damien Newman squiggle. Have you seen this? I'll share my screen here. I don't know if anyone's seen this before, but this was a great aspect to remind myself that
Yeah.
when we start on the left-hand side, this is where we all are at. We're all like all over the place, trying desperately to go from uncertainty to clarity and focus. And so it really does take quite a bit of time to get from the left side to the right side, especially if you've never done this type of work before. So one, I just want to say to everybody, you're doing brilliant work because you're actually working through the template and starting to reduce options and work with constraints. Remember, constraints are fantastic. We love constraints because they tell us what we can't do, which leaves a whole area we don't have to think about. But then once we get to this concept, which is really where we're focusing in our work with the PDC, we're just removing different options. So I love that you brought that up. Thank you, sir. That's great. And finally, Bjorn, how are you doing, sir? How's the course been for you thus far?
Been good. I agree with Christian that it gives a good general overview when you start thinking about those parts that you love and that you love a bit less. Well, I've also shared before that it's quite the struggle to do the course next to life, next to work. But did manage to catch up over Christmas. So that was good. And yeah, looking forward to the next steps. I have some friends of mine that are interested in what I'm doing, and they want me to think along. So it feels good to share. Yeah, I really like this journey that I started.
Awesome. That's great to hear, sir. Fantastic. All right, folks, why don't we jump into some questions? We've got a few this week, and if anybody has more, feel free to put them in there, or we can jump out and and Mintia just popped a new question, or you can unmute yourself and put that in. So, and then I've got my iPad on because I want to go into a little bit around soils that I think maybe has been missed or just needs a little bit of reinforcement as we go into soils. Okay. Let's see if I remember how to use my computer. Yep, seems like I do. Okay. So I want to jump in to this question that's been kicked down the road a little bit for a while here. So one of them was, I think this is from Linda, and she was asking about American pokeweed. It's poisonous, located on a sunny area of my property. I have a south-facing slope. When is the best time to remove it? How can I compost it in the wooded area, forest area in the north so wildlife can enjoy them? If I remove it now and mulch the area with leaves, would they just grow back? Okay, so a couple of things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I went about this because that's the more important aspect of this whole conversation versus just an answer. So when I get a question about a plant, or when there's a question within a site about a plant, the first thing I do is I go to Wikipedia and I start to learn about the plant's physiology, its reproduction, its cultivation, what's its origin, what are its uses, either from an indigenous perspective or from a medical grade perspective, because then you start to understand a little bit more about the plant. If you're not keen on biochemistry, I suggest cultivating just a little bit of interest to it because it's amazing what you can learn if you know how to read a molecule diagram and other aspects. But as I was poking around pokeweed, I learned a couple of interesting things. One is its young shoots are edible if you boil them twice, and then it's a hard boil both times and you change out the water. Basically, you're leaching out the toxins within the plant that are quite poisonous and can lead to death. But it's got these ornamental berries, which people really love. And that's usually the case. If there's an ornamental plant, the berries are beautiful. It's usually poisonous, it seems. One thing I found was, and I can't find anything to dispute this. So if this is the case, then we'll talk about approach here. But if it's not the case, then we'll have to talk about a different approach. But it doesn't seem like it produces or reproduces by rhizome, by root. So it seems like it's a self-seeding perennial. So basically the berries and the plants and all the plant materials and the roots even are poisonous to mammalia, but to birds it isn't. It's not poisonous to birds. So birds will eat the fruit and they'll carry the seed to someplace else. So basically, if you think about the life cycle of the plant, the plant has a root base. It has a dormant root base. It does produce shoots, and it builds and grows its vigor and its vital potential over the years. Basically, you have to disrupt that seed potential, or you need to pull the entire plant, or you need to kill the plant without pulling the plant. So those are kind of our three options, and are generally the options for killing plants that we don't want, removing them. So generally, when a plant is in its flowering stage towards its first seed production, it's when it's at it's most weakest, so to speak, in terms of vital force. Most of the vital force in the roots is coming up through the roots, is trying to produce flower to produce seed. Now, the reason why I say flower over seed production is that a lot of our persistent plants, a lot of our poisonous plants are seed vital early within the seed germination and or not seed production stage. So we want to be conscientious to kind of catch it at the time that we can catch it. And flowering is easy to notice as well. So generally pulling during flowering, cutting during flowering, deadheading is what it's called as well. So we remove the heads that produce the flowers and the seeds, can help to reduce the potential for that plant to continue. If you have the ability, be it the manpower or the ability to pull plants out, the labor, then pulling it works really well from what I've read and seen. My approach has always been for plants that are pernicious, is I scalp them during flowering, which means that I take a weed whacker or bush cutter and I get down to the roots and I basically scalp them right there. And then what I'll do is I'll spray agricultural vinegar, which is usually at 12%. You can usually buy it at agricultural supply. I'll spray it directly into that cut at the crown. So a plant has the roots and then the vegetative top, and in between the two is what's called the crown. And the crown can be thought of like the brain of the plant in a lot of species. This doesn't hold for every single species because nature is diverse and all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so the crown model, the idea that there's a place within a plant that changes between vegetative and root is useful, because that crown, if we can affect that crown, if we can affect the brain, generally we can affect the plant's vigor and total life force. So I would probably cut it down to that level. And then I would spray it with agricultural vinegar. How would you spray it? Put it in a spray bottle. You use a backpack sprayer. You want to make sure you get it either brand new or you get it from a forestry outfit that's used for firefighting. You don't want it from agricultural reuse or supply, reuse or used, because chances are it's going to have some kind of biocide in it, and you don't want to be mucking about with that. And then usually after that, what I would do is I would tarp it for a bit. So tarping or solarization can be used to basically heat up an area to promote growth, and then have that growth not find photosynthetic capacity, find sunlight and die out and grow and die out and grow and die out and grow. So I would usually use a scalping and application of agricultural vinegar, and then solarization for pernicious plants that are hard to remove. So that's how I would do that for Linda. For Bjorn, so let's talk a little bit about this question, because this is a great series of questions and probably going to take us the majority of the time here. I'll stay on later. I'm already knowing this is going to take a long time to answer Minthea's question, or we'll put it to next week. But for Bjorn, in this assignment, I missed a bit about so what is a step after soil assessments. The soil showed that I have almost only silt, 95%, very little clay, and no sand. Not sure what to do with this information now. The soil texture by field chart also only concludes the type of soil. In one of the videos, it was mentioned that 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay is ideal, and explains why. Okay, but now I don't want to start carrying sand onto the 15 acres of soil. My guess is building OM will have a positive effect, but that won't increase sand. In general, it's unclear to me about how to proceed. So great question. We're going to go through this sort of step by step. We're going to talk about some big concepts. We're going to go through it. But my first question for you, and don't look at my answer that I've already written down. What's soil? What is soil to you at this point in the course? What do you think is soil? Bjorn, I think your microphone is switched to something else, or maybe you, yeah, there we go.
Maybe that's better.
Yeah, perfect. Go for it.
I said, I thought that you would be the one answering questions. No, what is soil to me at this point? I understand, of course, that there's different types of, let's say, particles. So indeed, the sand, the silt, and clay. That's clear. That makes sense. Then I understand that there is organic matter in the soil, and I also understand that there's a whole bunch of nutrients. So that'll be mostly minerals. And I understand that the soil should be full of bacteria and fungi. So I think that list to me is what soil is.
Awesome. Anybody else want to add to that or give an alternative?
I think I just remember space. Like that was something I remember watching the video, how important space is, and that kind of, I didn't know that before. So maybe I'll just add that in.
Great thing to add. What else? Anything else to add?
Hopefully some water. That would be cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Where there's water, there's life. Where there's no water, there's no life. Water's useful. What else?
Well, maybe not from more of a composition standpoint, but from like more of a meaning standpoint. Would that help to discuss, or are you looking
Yeah,
for
please.
composition answers?
100%.
I think of when I would have thought of soil before, I would have thought of like the soil I use to plant house plants in, like what material can grow from, is what I would like kind of define soil. But then I understand now soil is not just necessarily, not all of it is like quote unquote good soil or bad soil. So I think, I don't know, soil's broader than I thought of. So that includes the sand and the silt and the clay and that stuff. So I don't know.
100%. Yeah. I think we're on to the thread that will be useful in starting to define the question, which is soil has some characteristics that regardless of where we are in the world, there should be some characteristics that we're going to see anywhere. And then it's a hyper localized phenomenon that will be very specific and very community related. And like all communities, any community you walk into, they're so unique in how they operate, but there are some general characteristics that we can find. So one of the first characteristics is the organisms that live in the soil that we commonly know as the soil food web, as first discovered in the late 80s by Dr. Elaine Ingham, are terrestrial. And terrestrial organisms need oxygen, they need air. So we need to have air space within our soils to ensure that the organisms are alive and thriving. Without that, they don't live. So we need space, also called shelter, right? They're just like us. When we take a look at the soil, it's just like ice. We need shelter, we need air. Great. But we also need water, right? Where there's water, there's life. We are a carbon-based, water-loving planet where the majority of our species, if not all of them, have those inherent characteristics that they are water-based. They need to have water. Without water, we get sluggish, we get problematic. The other thing with shelter is we need to have a temperature range. Too cold, we're going to go dormant. Too hot, we're either going to die out or go dormant. So both of those things, we need to have a good temperature range. And one of the major limiting factors of soil in the northern hemisphere and also the southern hemisphere, but once we get past those latitudes, soil temperature is one of our major limiting factors. And so from a first principle perspective, you could think, how could I increase the soil temperature early? Would that give me a boost in production? And it would. And we'll come back to that as a story later on. One of the other things we absolutely need is we need community, right? So we need to have community within this structure with air and water. But for community, before that, we need food. We need something for that community to feed upon because life is predation. So we need some kind of food. And sometimes those are lower organisms. Sometimes that's primary producers that are actively taking food off of plants. And then we need a community of organisms. And what we've learned from Dr. Elaine Ingham's experiments during her thesis work is that she isolated the bacteria, the fungi, the nematodes, the microarthropods, the protozoa, and then the macro versions of those, plus the earthworms that were found in the soil. And she found that if she had a wheat, W-H-E-A-T, a wheat seedling, and she had it in a terrarium with only one or two of those singular different elements of the soil food web, the seedling would get to a certain stage and die out. But once there was all of those elements, not only just the biological community, but also the air, the water, the shelter, the food, then they had a thriving community. Why do I start us off with first principles? Because if I give you a straight answer about your soil type, it's not as useful. But if you can learn to think about soil, about what is the soil missing? So that way, when you come to a site and the people say, well, it's okay soil, but it's been driven on for 20 years. You can immediately go, oh, interesting. I know soil needs air. And with all this driving, there's going to be compaction. So one of the first things we're going to have to do is mechanically decompact the soil or vegetatively. So I'm trying to get you to think about these categories so that when you come to a site, you go, okay, what's missing here? What am I going to be working on? You can think of these as all links in a chain. And if one of them are broken, chances are everything's going to fall apart. So once you have a sense of that, then we can go into some of the constituent parts. So there's material that makes up soil. And in this course, we talk about it as parent material or structure. We have sand, we have silt, and we have clay. Which one is the largest particle out of those three?
Sand.
Sand is the largest. And what's the smallest?
Clay.
Clay. Why is the size of the particle of the parent material, before we get to organics, important when it comes to building good soil?
I guess if the particles are larger, there's more space for air.
The particles are larger, there's more space for air. Great. And what's the inverse of that, which might also be useful?
Maybe the smaller particles bind easier.
They
So
can.
they might also bind minerals easier.
Some of them do. Clay in particular does. But the inverse of that is that while the larger particles can, because they're taking more volume, and for their volume, they have less surface area, thus they create more what's called interstitial airspace. Once you get to the smaller particles for the same volume have more surface area. So if that's confusing to you, no worries. It was super confusing to me years ago. So what I want to do is I want to run through this this little design explanation, which I think will be useful. So I came up with this a few years ago when I was working and teaching for Gaia University, Gaia College. And so what I want to do here is have an idea that if we have something like a file cabinet, hopefully everybody has a good sense of what a file cabinet is. And for the sake of this argument, we're going to say that this file cabinet has a unified number of units. So we're going to say that this area here is the same as this, is the same as this, is the same as this. So we're taking a look at this. How many units of surface area does this file cabinet have? Well, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the same number of units on the opposite sides because it has a top and 2 other sides. So we're going to say that this has 12 units of surface area. Now, let's say that this is our sand. So this is a particle of sand. So this sand has 12 units of surface area for the same volume. Now let's take the exact same volume. So we're going to draw out the exact same volume. And then this time, instead of using the outside, let's think that in the same volume, we have all these file folders that are inside it. So we have all these file folders that, again, for purposes of what we're talking about, this file folder would have exactly the same number of units as, let's say, this unit here. So let's say there's, well, I don't know, let's call it 100. Let's call it 100 file folders within this top drawer. And each one of these units, for each one of these file folders, has 4 units of surface area. So we could say that in this top, there's 400 units of surface area. In this bottom, there's 400. And so we could say that this is 800 units of surface area. And let's call this silt, because silt is the smaller in between the two. Now, if we went to the smallest size, and this works out well because clay is actually a platelet, a positively charged top and a negatively charged bottom. So if we have our folder again, and in our folder, let's say we have 10 sheets of paper. So we have 10 sheets of paper that all have two sides. So 10 sheets of paper per folder. So if we have 10 of those, each of them have two sides. So that's 20 units of surface area for each folder, 20 units times 100. Now we're at 2,000 units of surface area for the top, 2,000 for the bottom, and then we are 4,000 units of surface area, and this is clay. Okay. So we went through this process to make a very important realization that when it comes to water holding capacity, surface area is how we hold water in soil. So you can think that you're going to have a lens of water on each of these pieces of surface area, each of these units, not pieces, of surface area. And similarly here, if we were to take our file folder and to open it up, there would be a surface area on this side and that side, and similarly down here. So what do we know now about the relationship between our particle size and the ability to hold water when it comes to surface area? What seems apparent at this point to you?
That as long as the particles are small enough, which I guess water molecules are, the smaller the composition of your soil, so clay, silt, or sand, the more water it will be able to hold.
That's right. So the smaller the particle, the more surface area and the more water your soil will be able to hold. Now here's one of the rubs. Once we get to clay here, we can have such a small particle size because clay is platelets, and they're so small that a rootlet that is barely 1 millimeter thick literally can't get in between the clay platelets to access the water. So now knowing this, what kind of assumption can we make about soil or the composition of it?
That the roots can't penetrate it.
Correct, which is what we came to already. But what does that mean about composition? What are we aiming for in terms of composition?
You can't have too much clay, otherwise nothing can grow in it.
Right, so the extremes are problematic. On the far side, there's sand, which has a lot of volume, but not a lot of surface area. And on the other side is clay that has a lot of surface area, not a lot of volume, but because of that, the plant rootlet can't actually access that water. So like all things, we're kind of looking at the Goldilocks zone, this area in the middle, right? This is kind of the area we're looking at in between here. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and this story is about a German horse rearer who worked with horses, had a very muddy paddock, basically felt there was too much clay in there, and there was enough sand. And so what they did is during the winter, they mixed in sand into the paddock. You tell me what happened come spring and summer. What did they effectively make? They didn't add air. They didn't add organics. All they did was take clay, a very fluid substance, and put sand, a very hard substance, respectively speaking, together. What did they make out of that?
Wouldn't know.
Made a very hard surface. They made a surface so hard that it would chip the horse's hooves. They basically made organic concrete because the pressure of the hooves were constantly compressing down the sand and the clay together. So hopefully what we have said and demonstrated in that moment is it's not about adding the missing component directly to the material, because there is such a organic and by that I mean biological and biotic and abiotic. So there's living factors and non-living factors that create soil, that churn soil. So what they realized far too late is what they should have been doing is adding more organic matter, because organic matter shifts this whole conversation. We haven't even got into cation exchange capacity yet, but when we get to the center here, change things. When we get to the center here, if we add any sort of organic, let's make sure we're using the right tools. If we switch to any sort of organic matter, what happens is as that organic matter, as it decomposes, it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, but it has a huge amount of surface area and it's much larger than clay. It's much larger than clay. So we have the opportunity with adding organic matter, and that can be living or dead. We can add living or dead organic matter, that we have the ability to increase the water holding capacity of the soil while resisting what we get here with clay, which is saturated soils. I'm going to introduce another concept to you. So when we're looking at soil underneath a microscope, if soil holds together, this is what's called a soil PED. So it's a molecule of soil that is visual to the eye. And if we have water, then that water usually holds around each soil particle within this molecule, so to speak. And what's left over is this interstitial airspace. And this airspace is necessary for those soil food web organisms to live. That makes sense so far? Okay, I'm seeing nodding. So what the problem is that when we start to water our soil, so when we water our soil, we have two areas that we're trying to seek to avoid. So one is dry and one is saturated. When a soil is saturated, all of this interstitial airspace is gone, and this is completely filled with water. What is the problem when a soil goes completely aquatic? What issue do we have?
Becomes anaerobic.
Comes anaerobic, no oxygen. The organisms that are in it are terrestrial, they need oxygen, and they die. So it could be saturated for a moment, and they'll generally weather the storm. But basically what we're looking for, and everything we're doing, is we're looking for this beautiful state of what's called field capacity. Field capacity is what we saw before, where the areas within here, all of these areas within here, oh, I gotta do it this way. I remember. Oh, I'm taking out a lot more than I should be. All right, fine. We'll go back. So when we get to this, basically what we're doing is we're removing all that water, or we're filling only to the point to where that water can safely be absorbed. And then we're down into having an amount of water that's specifically around the particles, but not within the interstitial airspace. And the ability for a soil to hold on to that water is usually dictated by its surface area and how much mulch, living or dead, is on top of that soil. Because if it doesn't evapotranspirate or transpire through the plants, then it has to move through gravity. And the cool thing about soil and water is that water works on this these two forces called cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion is the ability for water to cling to itself, and adhesion is the ability for water to cling to something else, for its ability to add to itself. And cohesion and adhesion are the reasons why when you spill some red wine on your shirt, it moves in 3 dimensions and doesn't just move down due to gravity. It's because the micro forces of cohesion and adhesion resist gravity. They're so strong, they resist gravity, which means that they'll move in a 3-dimensional wetting pattern. This is why swales work, because if you've got a swale that's coming down an area and fills with water, what'll happen is this wetting pattern, it'll have this whole wetting pattern that will generally move downhill, but will also move uphill a little bit through that capillary action, which is cohesion and adhesion. Why do I talk about cohesion and adhesion? Because knowing that means you have to find the right watering level that moves past cohesion, but before you get to saturation. So that way it uses cohesion and adhesion, gets you into field capacity, but before saturation. And we were already talking about these different types of materials that can hold on to water. So these materials that we have down here, this may be sand. This may be a whole bunch of platelets of clay. So these are tiny, tiny platelets. This may be silt. And if this is organic matter, the great thing about organic matter is every 1% of organic matter you increase on 1 acre of land, you end up with 20,000 gallons or 80,000 liters of further water holding capacity. It is one of the best holders and creators of water holding capacity, WHC, within your soil. So what we want to do within the work that we do is we want to increase water holding capacity, and we want to do it by the easiest method possible. It's not that easy to take, as Bjorn said in his question, a bunch of clay or sand and take it over hectares of land. It's not a feasible way to do it. So basically what we do is we turn to organic processes, living processes, that will start to slowly change the composition, the parent material of that soil, into something that has more water holding capacity, usually through organic matter. And the way we do that is through either static or active ways of creating soil, which we'll get to in a second. I'm just noticing there's a chat here. Why did it go hard with sand? Would have been different if they'd mixed it up. Yeah, so great question. So basically, if we have a surface of soil, and let's say that this soil is largely clay, which it was in our example. And let's say then what we do is we add in sand, which again, from a particle size is quite large. And then if we add on a horse hoof, what'll happen is that the horse hoof will basically compress the clay and the sand to the point to where the clay will become, let's put it over here, the clay will become less deep because it will be compressed, and the sand will compress to be within the horse hoof's compression range. So basically what we get is a whole bunch of sand that's mixed in with clay, which is basically a plaster. So if you've ever seen or been around gypsum plaster, which is the more common within North America, but clay plasters are still very common within Europe and Asia. And basically what we do is we take a hard trowel, we mix our material, and then we put it onto a surface, and then we trowel it on. We basically are taking all those little hard bits of the sand and then pushing them together, so that way we've got a hard surface. Does that answer your question, Deanna? Feel free to unmute. It's more easier to answer.
Oh, yes, I just said thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Sounds good.
I
Awesome.
like that diagram. Perfect.
Great. So Bjorn saying I watched the video on biochar, amazing microscope close-ups. Yeah, we'll talk about biochar in a second. It's a very cool addition to soil that can do wonderful and great things. Okay, and then the last concept I want to talk about just briefly. Lovely. The world opens up again. I want to briefly talk about cation exchange capacity. So basically, cation exchange capacity is the ability for a soil to hold on to anions and ions. It's the ability to hold on to nutrients. And clay has the ability to hold on to lots of cations and anions, and sand doesn't because it's more neutral. Organic matter, again, has the ability to hold on to electrically charged minerals, which is what the soil needs to grow and thrive. And because of that, if we increase organic matter within our soil, then we increase the ability for it to hold on to more and more nutrition. Cation exchange capacity, CEC, is sometimes thought of as a metric of fertility because of its ability to indicate the soil's ability to hold on to different nutrients. So the way we can increase organic matter, the way we can increase CEC is to add organic matter. The way we can increase WHC, water holding capacity, is to add organic matter. So the majority of our response to building good soil should be to add Organic matter.
Organic
Both muted and unmuted, the face was making the same shape. So we know it's organic matter. So we used to joke that it was always about adding ohm. It was always about adding ohm. Because it's always about this idea of adding organic matter in the way that makes most sense for your situation. So this is where we start to get contextually specific. So we know that we need to create air, we need to create shelter, we need to create water, we need to have food, we need to have some sort of material, and we need to have community. We need to have all these things to make good soil. So if you're missing any of those, it's an easy way to to start to identify and assess your soil. Just think about, what am I missing in this soil? And that's where, when you were doing your soil samples, lifting it up, looking at it, starting to get a sense of it. If it looked like it was slippery and tight and you could make long ribbons, chances are there's lots of clay. And so now you should think, okay, I know that there's not going to be a lot of air. There's not going to be a lot of interstitial airspace. There's going to be water, but it's not going to be as biologically available to plants or to some of their microorganisms that work with it. So that clay definitely is going to need amendment. Now, conventionally, in both farming and landscaping, amendment means grab a bag of something and mix it into your soil. And what do we know about mixing soil? We know that immediately we're going to remove a lot of the mycelium. We're going to remove that incredible hyphal net that mushrooms create, that fungi creates, And it's so necessary to the soil food web that every time we break that up, it's going to take another 3 to 5 to 10 years, depending on the species, to reform. So generally, we're not going to want to decompact the soil unless it's so compacted that we have to do it once or twice to move it, which is fine. Sometimes that's the solution we need. When we then get into our fungals, we want to be certain that fungals have enough food in the soil. And what generally do fungals eat? They eat carboniferous material. They eat lichens. They eat wood. So we need to ensure that we also have those types of species within there as well. So generally, water holding capacity, cation exchange capacity, we're trying to improve. And the way to do that is organic biological processes that are dependent upon what you have access to on your site. And again, what the site regulations are. There are some soil building strategies that are problematic in some regulatory environments, and what the clients have access to. So sometimes the clients don't have access to the best possible solution because they don't have the labor, they don't have the money, they don't have the time. It doesn't make sense in their area. So understanding all the different ways we can build soil is important. So soil is an organic, interactive community. How does that differ from compost? How is compost different than soil? What are your thoughts about that? How is compost different than soil?
Is compost only organic material and soil has made up of other components?
Really, really spot on. Really what we're talking about is soil usually has parent material, usually has a longevity, it usually has a generational longevity. It has epigenetics that have been expressed and suppressed throughout years. It's usually indicative of a place. It's completely dependent upon the other orders for the scale of permanence for all things agricultural. It's dependent on climate. Dependent on geography, it's dependent on water. All those things will create, plus the biological and the biotic and the abiotic factors will create that type of soil. Compost is a specifically made material that usually doesn't have a lot of parent material. It's one of the only times you can add an amendment into a soil is by adding it to compost first. So if you're trying to increase, let's say, the clay of something, you could add dried clay to a compost. It's not necessary because the compost, if it's made well, will do that already, because organic matter has the ability to, as we talked about, increase cation exchange capacity and increase water holding capacity and resist compaction. So all those things are really important. So it doesn't really make sense to do it then. Also, it's a managed process. We could almost ubiquitously say that compost is a managed process. It's a way of making it. So we know within what's called the Berkeley hot method, or the hot Berkeley method, that we can create compost in somewhere between 18 to 28 days by creating our piles that are at least a cubic meter or 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And by taking the outside of that compost pile and making it the inside of the new pile as soon as it hits about 58 degrees Celsius. We know that we can take the outside to the inside. We know we can take the inside to the outside, and it will decompose if we have the right ratios of materials, which are usually 20% nitrogen, 40% browns and 40% greens. Generally, we can do that every time, no problem. We'll have a good compost. What do you do with compost after it's done? How do you then introduce that into soil in a productive way that doesn't disturb the existing structure of that soil?
Put it on top and maybe cover your existing soil first.
Right. So we're starting to get into the site specifics. As usual, our answer to anything in permaculture should be, it depends. So what does your site look like and what are you trying to do? So usually when we're top dressing with compost, what we'll do is we'll move aside the mulch if there is mulch there, and we'll dress with, half an inch to an inch to 2 inches, making sure never, as usual, to let anything touch the crown of the tree. We don't want soil up against the crown of the tree. We don't want mulch against the crown of the tree, because that will introduce a vector for disease. Because these materials decompose and rot, and if you decompose and rot beside the external structure of the tree or the plant, you could have a vector for disease. So we don't want to do that. So top dressing. Top dressing is a great way to bring compost into a site. What's another way to bring compost into a soil or site?
Maybe work it into the soil, although you mentioned that you preferably don't want to disturb it, but maybe if it's necessary.
100%. So we can incorporate, and we can incorporate in two major ways. There's other ways, but these two are kind of the most important. One is we can incorporate it in a full plow, so we can actually till the soil and we can incorporate it into it. And if we're already going to be decompacting a soil because it's physically compacted, then why not? If we're already going to be decompacting it, why wouldn't we take that opportunity with that disturbance to add soil, or pardon me, to add compost to it and directly into those depths? The other thing is we could tilth it. And tilthing is basically working in any kind of amendment into the first inch or 2 inches, the first 3 to 6 centimeters of a soil. And it's not done with a plow, it's done with a tilther, which has really tiny tines and spins around and basically just churns up the soil. So we would apply it on top and we would tilth it in. So that way we're only kind of doing a top dressing incorporation, not a full plow. The third way is to create something called an aerated compost extract. And an aerated compost extract, again, is really leaning on Dr. Elaine Ingham's excellent work, which is creating fantastic compost, and then taking that compost and putting it into a perforated but inflexible bag that we then put into a volume of water that is non-chlorinated, non-chlorinated, doesn't have any water preservatives in it to keep water from having things grow in it, because we want things that are alive to grow in it. And with this tea, what we were doing is we were taking what's called a diaphragmatic pump. A diaphragmatic pump pushes air, not water, and it pushes a huge volume of air through this volume of water and basically pummels that compost in that non-flexible mesh bag. And what happens? All of the biologically active organisms in that bag fall into solution. And once they're in solution, we can then apply them with sprayers, again, sprayers from good sources, and we can apply them from an extract perspective. We can apply them over top of soil, of fields, you name it, we can apply it onto it as long as it can be sprayed. And with aerated compost extract, usually we're only brewing, again, we're using tea terms, but there's no heat involved. So it's one of those things we have to get around. We can usually let it run for a couple of hours and we'll have extracted all the organisms out of it. And that's what's called an extract, aerated compost extract. When we get to what's called an aerated compost tea, it usually means what we're doing is we're adding some kind of amendment like fish emulsate that are helping to have a certain number of organisms within our compost within the bag to proliferate, to grow, to reproduce, which means that a compost tea has a narrow number of species, but a higher population, and a compost extract has a more diverse population and lower populations, which means that when we create a tea, it's usually more bacteria in a tea, and it's a little stickier, which is why teas are usually applied to leaves specifically, so that way they stick onto the leaves and those organisms will help the plant. And with extract, pardon me, we don't do that. We just extract out and apply. Great thing about compost extracts is you can do it as many times as you want in a year and you're never going to over apply. Usually only have to do it twice, once in the spring, once in the fall, usually after the last frost or before the first frost, or if you're in the tropics, whenever it fancies you. This then increases the organic soil food web into the area that you're in, and they actually go to work without having to be on compost to do it. And so it's a longer process in that those organisms will eventually get you to the right place you want to, as long as your soil is being covered either by mulch, living or dead, and it has the ability to have water come to it. So that's where we get to some of the passive earthworks and how we form different types of soils, be it in things like swales or hugelkultur or lasagna gardens or terraces or garden beds. Whenever we're moving soil and forming it up, that creates that soil forming that we're talking about. Okay, so we've gone through the majority of the elements. We talked about decreasing, right. Okay, so let's talk about timing for some of these things. So we can make compost in 18 to 28 days with the hot Berkeley compost method. Super quick, super fantastic, incredible way of doing it. Or we can leave it to natural process, which at present count can take anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 years. And that's kind of our volume of change. Now, depending on your site, what they want to do, how much effort they want to put into it, you could be doing things like this every week, every other week to apply onto a site and increase the biological diversity. And it increases the resiliency of plants. So root shoot soil created by Joe Tobias out of Burnaby, Vancouver, is a living soil consultant. And she has been working with a cut flower farm now for a couple of years. And the cut flowers are now lasting twice as long as their competitors after being cut because they are so biologically alive. They have such vital vigor because of the soil amendments that are being put onto, which is aerated compost extract. They are very, very alive. So when we take a look at all of these pieces, they all add up to this wonderful byproduct of plants and healthy plants at that. So specifically for Bjorn, if his soil is mostly silt base with a little bit of clay, from a first principles perspective, before we go into the nitty gritty, what's missing in that soil? Most likely.
Not sure what your question is.
Taking a look at those components we talked about, air, water, food, material, community. Taking a look at your write-up, my clay is mostly 95% silt and 5% clay. What can we already start to determine on some of these factors that are probably missing in that soil to increase the vitality, the fertility of that soil?
I would say organic matter.
Organic matter is missing, but if we take one step before that and we go, if it's mostly silt and sand, it's going to be very compacted, likely. It's not going to have a lot of structure to it. And so organic matter would be the thing or the solution that we would go to improve upon that soil. Yeah, 100%. But really what I would look at that soil, and you might have seen it in your soil samples, is it's likely that we don't have a lot of structure to the soil. Silty clay soils don't have a lot of structure. They don't have a lot of hold to them. They don't create really nice soil beds like crumbled cake. It's usually quite dusty and dry. If it gets wet, it's slippery and slick, but doesn't form long ribbons because it's so silty. And this is usually in places that are high in water flow. So geologically speaking, there was usually water flow that was coming through here. And so you had this material that the sand would keep rolling down and the clay would be on top, but the silt had a chance to actually form up and deposit down. So when I take a look at your site, knowing it a little bit more as I do, I would say that we need to introduce organic matter to it. And we also need to introduce biologicals. We need to introduce the soil food web as much as possible to it. Now, because from what I've seen of your aerials, it probably lends itself well to grazing. Once we start to add in what's called mob stock grazing, which is a number of animals that are confined to graze together like they used to be when they had predation upon them. So when there was a predator, animals would stick together and they would move quite frequently, which means that the plants wouldn't be eaten down to their crown and beyond. They would just be eaten down to what's called the ice cream the really sweet, juicy, tender, and and it would be left to regenerate. And what happens above, so happens below. When you remove material from above in a plant, especially a perennial grass, some of that material is sloughed off as carbon in the soil. And we know that carbon, as we talked about before, is a food source for fungi. So that just becomes more and more food. But also, if a root dies out, what does it leave around it? It leaves space. So if we put a root into the ground and we don't pick it, or we don't mess with it, and it just decomposes naturally, that all becomes food for the living soil food web. That becomes interstitial airspace. It becomes cavities. It becomes the final form of bioturbation. Bioturbation being the soil's ability to turn itself and actually create pathways through things like earthworms and other organisms like arthropods within the soil. So we know we need to add organic matter. We know we need to add biologicals, and we know that mob stop grazing would be a good idea if, again, that one circle, the client's abilities, their desires, their skills is there. Because if they have it, they have that skill set, then they could mob stop graze, keep the animals together, watch the grass until it gets down to where it needs to, and then move them again. And through that process, you can also build soil quite quickly. Adding to that aerated compost extract, even more so. Adding to that top-dressed, finely sieved compost, even more so. So all the way along, we can stack different factors within this to build more and more and more resilient soil throughout a time period, depending on what the client has in terms of time, money, and energy. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah.
How are we feeling about soil now in terms of the general big ideas to small ideas? What are we taking away from this?
As you said, the context specificity.
Mhm.
So knowing all the elements, analyzing them one by one, and then seeing your context. Yeah, that'll be a good way to go about it. I think I was missing that list of different elements.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Does this feel like the overarching idea of what soil is, what it's necessary to do, and how to go about it feels known to not just you, Bjorn, but to everybody else? Is this feeling like, okay, now it's actually starting to crystallize, or is there something missing still? C'est bon? Okay, thumbs up.
All good.
Awesome. All right. So Minthia had a quick question, and I'm going to stay on. Obviously, I knew I was going to go over, and I have. So Minthia had a question of, I'm wondering about placing ponds on my site. My soil is so sandy and rocky. What are the options? Hoping to not have to line it with plastic, but what else can you do? I've never heard of people bringing in clay to line a pond, but maybe they do. Apologize, but I'll have to watch the replay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ponds and lining of ponds. So generally, leaky ponds are a great thing. There's nothing wrong with a leaky pond. And as an engineer told me early on in my work in permaculture, everything leaks eventually. There's no such thing as something that doesn't leak. Enough time, enough entropy, everything leaks. So our point should not be to make a totally sealed pond, but to make a pond that will slowly leak. And this will go counter advice to a lot of other practitioners in the field. So definitely seek out others and have different opinions. My opinion is based upon seeing the work and working with people like Sepp Holter and Zach Weiss and Jeff Lawton and others who have a history of conversation about creating leaky ponds, including Mark Shepard. So when we're creating ponds, first and foremost, we want to find a good spot in the landscape where it potentially can can capture the amount of water required to fill the volume that we have, which is basically just volumetric math. As we've gone through season 5 or week 5 in the assignments there, we already know how to calculate a catchment area, already know how to use the coefficient factors to know how much overland water will come. And generally we have a sense of swales already. So if a swale can capture that water, bring it into an impoundment of water, then we know that we can fill it. Generally, we want to take a look in the landscape and look for what's called inflection points. And this is where we go from convex to concave. And these are points where if you think of water picking up soil, being in solution, once it hits that inflection point, that convex to concave, it slows down and the silt and the sand all drop out. And what we can find the world over is in inflection points, it's usually where we're going to find the most amount of clay higher up in the landscape. We can always find it at the bottom of the landscape. That's usually not a problem. In places where Minthia is in Alberta, it's a very generally flat area, and they do what's called dugouts, a lot of agricultural dugouts where they dig into the landscape and they hold water in what's called dead load. Dead load is water that's below the existing grade. Live load is when it's above the grade. So if we have a dam that goes above the existing grade and holds water behind it, it's what's called live load. The reason for this is that regardless of where you're working, there will be regulations about dam construction. And if you don't work within those regulations, what you do is you leave your clients a big mess because you've suggested something that isn't possible. And that's why I always go back to 3 circles: client wants and needs, regulatory framework, and then the site's inherent characteristics. So once we find that spot that we can absorb water or we can collect water and we know has some functionality for landscape, if the water is all the way at the bottom of the landscape, it's not as valuable as water that can be held high up in the landscape. And this is why Jeff Lawton talks about when designing a water retention landscape, take the longest, highest contour and start working from there, because chances are you can collect water on that contour and hold water high up in the landscape. So generally, when we are lining ponds, we have a few options. One, if the material itself has a high enough clay content, or if there's a layer of clay within the landscape. This is why usually we'll take a look at the existing soil reports to see if there are veins or layers of clay, because if there are, we can potentially dig down to that and use that material to diaphragmatically line a pond. If not, the other way to do it is to take an excavator that has a little bit of shake within the knuckle that goes onto the hand, and basically take material that has a high clay content and with a bit of water, and literally start to compress, very similar to what we talked about with the clay and the sand, creating that concrete liner. Similarly, you basically vibrate the material, so basically it starts to close up within the bottom of the pond. The other thing we can do is we can just take a foot and a half of clay and line a pond right before rain. And generally, this is what we'll do in drier climates, in wetter climates, humid climates, because we know that there's enough rain to keep everything full. In the oil sands, they use something called bentonite clay. Bentonite clay will absorb and become 10 times its volume once wet, and is generally self-sealing in that if you cut into it over time with water, it'll actually self-seal. Gray clays, red clays aren't self-sealing. And this is why when a pond ends up being cut into, or a root comes into it and creates a penetration, people usually reach out to bentonite products to seal it up. Apparently there's a new product out that a colleague of mine is trying called Damn It out of Australia. That's an enzyme that actually works on the organic matter of the soil around cracks, around flow. It becomes activated and starts to create a mucilaginous material, kind of like the gley, G-L-E-Y, clay soils that are found naturally in ponds. Those are the types of soils that you're walking in your rubber boots. Eventually you'll step out and your boot stays and your stocking foot goes right in the water. And there's been processes around pigs and ducks that have glayed, G-L-E-Y-E-D, that have glayed an area, but I haven't found any successful real life examples of that since I started 15 years ago, 16 years ago. So I haven't yet seen that work. Basically what you do is you fence in animals, be it pigs or ducks or geese, you feed them an area, you water them in an area. It's very mucky, you can imagine, because they're defecating and they're eating in the same area. But with their feces interacting with the soil, they create a glaze soil. And over time, you move that area around and hopefully you fill it at the same time. I had a colleague of mine, David Bayline, who did this and found that it was very difficult to do, shockingly enough. The third thing is you can start to go into artificial liners, like EPDM liners that are a non-fire retardant. So this is important to note if you do start working with EPDM liners, high density polyethylene, the majority of them have fire retardant in them, and that cannot be for a pond. That will leach into that water, and regardless of what you use it for, it is a biocide. So you don't want to be doing that at all. But is possible. For somebody like Minthia, who's in Alberta and is generally working with a culture that knows how to make dugouts. And dugouts are generally geomorphic. They're very rectilinear structures. There's a product out in the tar sands called impregnated bentonite geotextiles, which are basically sheets of kind of mesh plastic with bentonite internally to it, and they're laid in geometric flat areas to create lined ponds. And if the previous solutions don't work in a small test site, I would then recommend going to something like that. Again, doing a small test site and seeing if it holds. Because generally you want to make sure in a nucleated design something works before then you expand it out. Well, Minthia, you're not here to respond, but I'll ask everybody else. Any follow-up questions to that in terms of pond and pond linings and those types of meanderings and thoughts?
I have one question. I can imagine the pond can be beneficial, but I think beforehand you want to know more or less how much it leaches, because you don't want to fill up your pond every day. That doesn't work. So is there any way to know?
Yeah, once you know the volume of your pond, you can monitor if it loses X amount of height and then do the volumetrics on what that volume is. That would be easy enough to do. Generally, when we're working in these situations, we're just trying to create as much water holding capacity as possible. So generally below a pond is where you're going to plant more water loving materials, because generally they're going to want to. You never plant trees on the dam wall or near the dam wall because it can puncture in and get into your water. But generally, if we were downslope, let's say, we might start to do some production downslope, because it would be one of the first places within a landscape if it took time. Because this is the other thing. I once rehabilitated a pond knowing in the first year to 3 years it wouldn't hold water, and finally in year 4 it started to hold water because all the processes worked together to make it. And I was I was vilified in that first year when I said it will not hold water in the first year, because we were on bedrock, right? So first off, they didn't want to use a plastic liner, almost impossible to do otherwise. And so they didn't want to pay for impregnated geotextile, so we made it. I don't recommend this. We took jute bags and powdered bentonite. It was the dirtiest job, second dirtiest job. And basically made the mats, put the mats into the pond, put the glaze soil that was there on top of the mats, overlap, try to, do all the things we could do. And I told everybody it's not going to work in year 1. It might work in year 5. And finally in year 3.5, it started to hold water. And it's so funny because I get photos of them being like, it's amazing, it started to work. I'm like, I told you that would happen, but that's okay. So yeah, generally when we're taking like a leaking of pond, you can do that from a volumetric space. And then just having a really good idea about that pond shape. And usually what I'll do is I'll design that pond shape in something like SketchUp. That is a 3-dimensional volumetric, make sure it's sized appropriately, and then just take a foot down off of it. And it's really easy to do when you're working in SketchUp, if that's of value. It's just always if that's going to be a valuable exercise. Okay, almost 30 minutes over. It's time to call it a wrap. Thanks everybody. That was fun. Talked about soil, kind of did big to small. What are everybody taking away from the call today? What feels important that you picked up?
I think the soil stuff was really helpful just to like go through with you versus theory, like picturing and drawing it out. So I don't know, just keeping that in mind for any soil activities that I do, basically. I'm curious, I know you like one of the things you said was obviously increasing organic matter. And maybe this is a question or a topic for another day, but then I'd also be curious to see like if yes, compost and mulch and all those things that we can do, but are there certain plants that also help to rehabilitate the soil if it's more sand heavy or clay heavy? Is that something that's possible as well?
100%. 100%.
Okay.
And I'll just give you a couple of examples, and please, after I finish, write it in there and we'll go into it more. Okay. But there's something called vegetative decompaction, which I really enjoy doing. And daikon radish and parsnip. Sometimes I like parsnip more than daikon because it's just a little bit easier to work with, and the seeds cheap as chips. But if you're in a really decompacted area and you don't need decompaction immediately, you can take the super slow road and you can just continually sow annual big tubers that will then create interstitial airspace, decompose, and become worm food. And doing that over time is an incredible way to produce decompaction and highly organic in a high organic matter soil. So yes, there are some plants that are more, call it soil building friendly. Yeah, it's a great question to put in. Yeah, let's chat about that next time.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd be super curious. Thank you.
Yeah, great. What's everybody else taking away from conversation today?
The file cabinet analogy was really helpful for the kind of thinking the high level of soil. So I appreciated that.
Awesome. Yeah, the other one I like to add to that, but I didn't this time, was take 3 buckets of the same volume, put in sand, silt, and clay, and you'll see that exponential rise on surface area. So you'll see that, the amount of water that goes into each is very, very different. And it really changes the wetting pattern and how we might create a watering schedule, which we could talk about at some time if you want. Christiane or Bjorn, what are you taking away from today? What feels valuable?
For me, it was a good recap of the whole soil subject, because I covered it during my studies, but since you don't use it every day, you kind of it kind of fades back in your memory. So it was good to get it freshed up, I guess. So to say.
Great.
Yeah, to me, Javin, I think I already said this, but my question was, of course, on the so what? Like, I've done my analysis, and now what do I do? Well, you gave many things to think about, so that's good.
Awesome. Great, guys. Well, it was a pleasure chatting with you today. As you can see, I'm not used to sitting in a chair because I'm super fidgety. I haven't quite beaten that out of me. I'm really, really, really pleased to have this chat with you guys today. As we get into the design conversations, feel free to point out design particulars that you're curious. Javin, if you were looking at this, what would you be seeing? What would you be doing? Because again, my job is not to look at your design and go, good design, bad design necessarily. My job is to make sure that you guys are understanding the process. So if you do have a specific design question, feel free to send it my way. And then one more thing I just want to make sure everybody is aware of, and I'm saying publicly, is our final designs are due, and not only our final designs, but all resubmissions are due March 11th at 9 a.m. So there's no extension on that because we have a rotating schedule of classes going on. So just to be totally clear, March 11th, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, all assignments, all resubmissions need to be in. Obviously, if there are things that need to be fixed within the final design and they don't get you to your grade, you'll have that week to make those changes. But there will be no 2, 3, 4 week submissions after that. Just doesn't happen. So just be aware of that. And if you do find yourself getting behind because there's something about the course that's frustrating, reach out to me. Happy to grab some time on Zoom and work it out. Or if you just, because of life, it's not going as fast as you need it to go and all the rest of it, you kind of have 2 options. One is, no one's ever asked me for my PDC certificate, ever, in 15 years. Nobody cares. I'm just about to apply for a certain status within the Permaculture Institute of North America, and I don't have it. I lost it in the flood. So even then, I'm not showing it to them because I was only a paper copy, not like with OSU, you could ask another one. So a secret, no one's asked me for it, ever. So do you need your certificate? I don't know. It seems like more and more there's more organizations, but even the students who end up getting placed or doing work, no one's asking for it. So does it really matter to have the certificate? I probably shouldn't say that because I'm, part of this engine that creates this certificate thing. But at the same time, I would say the most important thing is going through the work and getting your first design done. So if you want to do that and you're comfortable to do that on your own, great. If you can do that within the time limit and get your mark and get the certificate, awesome. If it takes you longer, and you want feedback, you may want to re-enroll. And I think it's cheap. I think it's like $200 to re-enroll the course. And hypothetically, you could go through the whole course again and get all the feedback again, or just start where you got to because life. Or you could just do it at your own pace, right? You could just work at it at your own pace, not get feedback, and go through the material, because you will have access to the materials for the rest of the internet's life, is what I've come to say. Because the internet's gone, well, life has changed dramatically for all of us. Awesome, folks. Well, thank you very much. Any questions, feel free to let me know, and have a lovely 2 weeks. Enjoy the course, play around with design, and have fun.
Thanks, Javin.
Bye,
Awesome.
thank
later.
you.
Gavin, bye everyone.
Take care, everybody. Bye.